My daughter-in-law hated everything about me. The smell of my cinnamon waffles, the three cats I loved, even the old house I'd spent my life building. Yet, because she and my son couldn't afford their own place, she stayed tormenting me under my own roof day after day. Just when I was about to throw those ungrateful kids out, they caught the scent of money elsewhere and vanished overnight. Before leaving, my daughter-in-law wrinkled her nose and sneered. "This house smells as poor as it looks." I didn't say a word, I just closed the door, feeling like I'd finally shut out the misery. But 3 days later, that same misery came knocking again. Are you curious to know what happened next? Stay with me till the end. I promise this story will shock you in ways you won't forget. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share to support my channel. My name is Abigail Hale. I am a retired baker living in Seattle, Washington. For most of my life, I worked side by side with my late husband, running two small neighborhood bakeries. We never became rich, but we had enough. Enough warmth, enough laughter, enough mornings that smelled of cinnamon and butter. When he passed away 5 years ago, the silence in our kitchen was deafening at first. I kept hearing the sound of his old radio even when it wasn't there. Eventually, I learned to fill the silence myself. I stayed in the same little house we bought 40 years ago in a quiet community where people still greet each other at the mailbox and bring pies to Sunday church gatherings. My days settled into a rhythm that felt almost sacred. I would wake before dawn, knead dough until the first light entered the kitchen, and bake just enough for my neighbors who still loved my recipes. After breakfast, I'd sit by the window with a cup of tea and the Bible open on my lap, sometimes reading, sometimes just thinking. The house never felt empty because I had three cats, Cookie, Ginger, and Snow, each with their own strange little habits. Cookie always slept on my recipe books, Ginger liked to chase sunlight across the floor, and Snow waited by the door every evening, as if expecting someone who never came. I often told myself this was what peace looked like in old age. No more rush, no more proving myself to anyone. I had lived, loved, and lost, and I was still standing. Sometimes my son Patrick called from his office in downtown Seattle. His voice was hurried, full of city noise, but I was always glad just to hear him. I never asked for much, just that he stay kind, that he remember the lessons his father left him. I thought life would remain that way, slow and safe, wrapped in the smell of fresh bread and soft memories. I didn't know then that peace can be fragile, and sometimes the ones who disturb it are the very people you trust most. When Patrick married Katherine Spencer, I tried my best to welcome her with an open heart. She worked at a fashion boutique downtown and always looked like she was walking out of a magazine cover. Her hair was perfectly styled, her nails were never chipped, and she spoke about lifestyle and aesthetics like a socialite who had just stepped off a yacht. On social media, she posted pictures of every latte, every brunch, every weekend trip, tagging words like elegance and luxury, even though I knew her paycheck couldn't possibly cover all that glitter. Still, I told myself to be kind. Patrick had chosen her, and that was what mattered. At the wedding, I smiled through every photo, even when I noticed how she barely glanced at me while calling me Mrs. Hale instead of Mom. She was charming in public, but her eyes often flickered with something sharp beneath the sweetness. I brushed it off, convincing myself that I was just overthinking things. All I wanted was for Patrick to have a peaceful life, a family of his own, a love that would last. He had always been gentle, too gentle, the kind of man who apologized even when he did nothing wrong. I knew that kind heart could be both his gift and his curse. After the wedding, they moved into an apartment near downtown Seattle. Patrick said it was closer to his office and to Catherine's store. For a while, everything seemed fine. Then one evening she called and started talking in her cheerful but slightly complaining tone. "Rent in Seattle is crazy expensive, Mom. We were thinking maybe it's better to move in with you for a while, to save up and plan ahead." I remember staring at the phone in silence, feeling something tighten in my chest. It was the first time I sensed a small tremor under the surface of my quiet life, a feeling that something was about to shift. I didn't know then that this simple conversation would mark the beginning of a storm I never saw coming. I thought about it for many nights before saying yes. I had lived alone for years and grown used to the quiet, the steady rhythm of my days. Still, I told myself, young people need a place to start, and if sharing my home could help them save for the future, then I should do it. The next morning, I rolled up my sleeves and began preparing the house. I dusted the shelves, wiped the windows until they shone, and aired out the old guest room that would now be theirs. I even replaced the small dining table with a larger one, imagining warm family dinners filled with laughter and stories. I wanted Patrick to feel that his childhood home was still a safe harbor. But the moment Katherine stepped through the front door, I sensed the air shift. Her perfume lingered sharply, cutting through the familiar scent of flour and sugar that had always comforted me. She looked around, not with gratitude, but with appraisal, as if calculating what needed to be changed. Her eyes paused at the floral curtains, the old family photos, the lace tablecloth, and I could almost hear her silent judgment. She murmured something about the house being charming in a vintage way, then smiled politely, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. I tried to welcome her the only way I knew how. The next morning, I woke early and baked my cinnamon waffles, just as I used to when Patrick was a boy. The smell filled the kitchen warm and sweet, the kind of scent that once meant home. But when Katherine walked in, she wrinkled her nose slightly and opened the window. She said the smell was too strong, that it might stick to her clothes before work. I stood there with the spatula in my hand, feeling the quiet between us stretch like a thin thread ready to break. I said nothing, only smiled and continued flipping the waffles, pretending not to notice the way she sighed. That was the first day I realized peace doesn't always end with loud arguments. Sometimes it fades quietly, one cold glance at a time. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when the first storm truly began. After church, I walked home with a small box of cookies I had baked for the neighbors. The sun was warm, the sky clear, and for a brief moment, I felt content. But as I turned the corner to my street, I noticed a pickup truck parked in front of my house and two men carrying planks of wood and buckets of paint inside. My heart skipped. I hurried through the gate and stopped cold. The sound of drills echoed from the hallway. The familiar scent of vanilla and old wood had been replaced by the sharp smell of paint and dust. Inside the living room was chaos. The furniture had been pushed aside, the curtains taken down, and pieces of the doorframe lay scattered across the floor. In the center stood Katherine, wearing her designer leggings and holding a rolled blueprint like she owned the place. She was giving instructions to the workers, her voice bright and commanding. When she saw me, she smiled, as if everything was perfectly normal. She said she was just brightening up the place because the house looked too old-fashioned and heavy. Then she laughed lightly and added that the smell of the old wood made her feel depressed. For a moment, I couldn't move. This was the house my husband and I had built with our own hands. I still remembered the day we painted the walls a soft cream color, the day we planted roses in the yard, the years it took to make this place a home. And now, without a word, it was being torn apart. My voice trembled when I asked her who gave permission for this. Katherine tilted her head and smirked. She said I should be grateful that she was helping to upgrade the house, giving it a more modern touch. I felt my hands grow cold. I wanted to shout to tell her to stop, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just stood there among the sawdust and broken wood, watching strangers hammer into the walls that once held my life together. Patrick wasn't home. He was probably working late, unaware of what was happening. Katherine clapped her hands and told the men to hurry, ignoring me completely. In that moment, I realized something painful and clear. This was no longer just a house renovation. It was the quiet beginning of being pushed out of my own home. I told the workers to stop immediately. My voice came out sharper than I expected, echoing across the half-torn living room. I said this house is under my name, and no one has the right to make changes without the owner's consent. The men looked at each other, hesitating, their tools still in hand. Katherine froze for a second, then her expression hardened. She pulled out her phone, her tone turning cold and dramatic. She called Patrick right in front of me and said he needed to come home because his mother was ruining her project. I could hear her voice rise, laced with fake tears, as she complained that I was being unreasonable and that all she wanted was to make our home look presentable. Less than half an hour later, Patrick rushed through the door, his hair messy, his face pale. He looked from me to Katherine, confused, caught between us. She ran to him, gesturing toward the unfinished walls and the paint cans scattered on the floor, saying I had humiliated her in front of the workers. Patrick took a deep breath and turned to me. His voice was soft, almost pleading. He said she only wanted to make the house nicer, that it wasn't such a big deal. I looked at my son, the same boy I once taught how to bake, the same boy who used to hug me every night before bed, and felt a sharp ache in my chest. I told him calmly but firmly that he could take any side he wanted, but this house belonged to me. I said I had the right to protect what his father and I built together. My hands trembled slightly, but my voice stayed steady. For a long moment, no one spoke. The workers had already stepped outside, sensing the tension. The house was silent, except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan. Katherine's jaw tightened. She grabbed her purse and muttered that she was going out, slamming the door behind her. Patrick stood there staring at the floor, unable to meet my eyes. I didn't ask him to. I simply walked to the window and looked out at the fading afternoon light, trying to steady my breath. That was the first time I felt truly alone in my own home, not because of silence, but because the warmth that once filled it had turned into something cold and distant. My husband and I started from nothing. Two young dreamers in Seattle, working long hours and believing that hard work could build a life worth living. We opened our first bakery in the early 1980s, when the city was still struggling after the recession. Rent was cheap back then, but so was everything else except effort. Every morning we woke before dawn, our hands dusted with flour, before the sun even rose. He mixed the dough while I prepared the fillings, and together we baked until the smell of cinnamon rolls and butter filled the street. In the evenings after closing, we scrubbed the floors ourselves, too tired to talk, but always sharing one look that said it was worth it. When business slowly grew, we opened a second bakery on the other side of town. It wasn't fancy, but people came for the warmth, for the feeling that every loaf and pie was made with real care. We didn't take vacations. We didn't dine out. Every dollar went into savings. Every dream anchored in something real. By the late 80s, we finally managed to buy a small townhouse in Ballard. I still remember the day we got the keys. We didn't have furniture yet, so we sat on the kitchen floor eating leftover bread and laughing like children. A few years later, we bought a wooden cottage in Snoqualmie, just outside the city. He said it would be our retreat when we grew old, a place where we could plant roses and watch the mountains change colors with the seasons. Every nail, every brick, every coat of paint in those two homes carries our fingerprints. On weekends, we painted the porch ourselves, argued over curtain colors, and fell asleep to the smell of fresh paint and coffee. Those weren't just houses. They were the story of our struggle, our love, our shared stubbornness to keep going when everything else seemed uncertain. Even after he passed away, I couldn't bring myself to sell any of it. People see walls and roofs. I see years of sweat laughter, burned batches of bread, and quiet evenings where we planned the future that never came true. That's why, to me, this house isn't just property, it's a living memory. When my husband died of a heart attack 5 years ago, I thought the world had ended. For weeks, I couldn't step into the kitchen without hearing his laughter echo in the corners. His coffee mug still sat by the sink, and I couldn't bring myself to move it. But grief, like dough, has to be worked through slowly. One morning, I decided to get up before sunrise and bake again, just as we used to. The smell of cinnamon and butter filled the house, and somehow I felt him there smiling quietly. From that day, I promised myself I would keep living, not just surviving, but living with purpose. I chose to be independent. I didn't want to become anyone's burden, not even Patrick's. I started baking for the local church every Sunday, donating most of what I made. The pastor said my waffles had a way of tasting like comfort, and the neighbors often stopped by to ask for a batch or two. I had a modest savings account, a small pension, and a few stable stock investments that my husband and I had planned together years before. It wasn't wealth, but it was enough for a simple, dignified life. My home became my sanctuary. Mornings began with the scent of freshly baked waffles and the soft hum of my old radio playing gospel hymns. The sunlight would stream through the kitchen window, warming the floor where my 3 cats, Cookie, Ginger, and Snow, liked to nap. They were my quiet companions, each with their own rhythm. Cookie always slept by my feet. Ginger chased shadows, and Snow liked to curl up near the Bible on the table. I spoke to them more than I care to admit, and in their soft purring, I found peace. Loneliness came, but it wasn't painful. It was a gentle kind of solitude, one that gave me time to think, to pray, to remember. I would sit by the window in the evenings watching the sun fade over the rooftops of Ballard and whisper a thank you to God for letting me grow old in peace. I thought this quiet rhythm would last forever. Until one evening Patrick called. His voice was hesitant, as if weighing every word. He said Katherine thought it would be practical for them to move in with me, and just like that, my peaceful life began to shift. Patrick was always a gentle child. From the time he could barely reach the counter, he stood beside me in the bakery, watching every movement of my hands as I kneaded dough or sprinkled sugar over warm pastries. He never talked much, but his quiet presence filled the room. Sometimes on rainy afternoons, he'd hum softly while helping me pack cookies for the neighbors. He wasn't ambitious or loud like other boys. He was thoughtful, the kind who'd rather fix a broken chair than brag about it. I used to think that kind of kindness was a strength, until I learned that in this world, gentle hearts can be too easily bruised. Patrick didn't have a mind for business. Numbers bored him, and he never cared much about profit. After high school, instead of managing the bakery, he decided to become an auto mechanic. I remember the day he came home in his oil-stained uniform, his smile bright but shy, saying he finally found something he enjoyed. I was proud, even if part of me wished he had stayed closer to what his father and I had built. Still, I never said that aloud. A mother's love means letting your child walk his own road, even when your heart wants to follow behind. We shared a quiet, easy bond. He would call me after work, asking what I had for dinner, or stop by with a small bag of groceries. On weekends, he still helped me fix the garden fence or replace the light bulbs. There was a simple rhythm between us. No grand words, just unspoken understanding. I knew he avoided conflict. He hated arguments, even small ones. When he was little, he'd hide in his room whenever his father and I disagreed about money. That softness stayed with him into adulthood. He was kind, but kindness without boundaries is like dough without structure. It collapses under pressure. The first time he introduced me to Katherine, I saw how dazzled he was. She was beautiful, confident, and spoke with the kind of charm that could fill an entire room. Her makeup was flawless. Her nails polished her laughter, rehearsed yet magnetic. She held his arm like she already owned him. I smiled because that's what mothers do. But deep down, something in me stirred a quiet warning, like the uneasy stillness before rain. I told myself not to judge, that maybe she would bring joy into his life. Yet as I watched her talk about fashion brands and modern lifestyles, I felt a faint tremor in the peace I had worked so hard to build. Katherine came from an ordinary background, but she carried herself as if she had been born into luxury. She was always chasing the image of a glamorous life, even if it meant living on borrowed money. Every few weeks, a new designer bag appeared in her hands, each one bought with monthly installments. She would hold it up proudly, saying things like how a woman's value was reflected in her taste. Sometimes she would show me photos on her phone, rooftop dinners, champagne glasses, and expensive shoes, all edited to look shinier than reality. I never said anything, but I wondered if she ever felt tired pretending to live in a world that didn't truly belong to her. Our worlds could not have been more different. I was raised to appreciate what I had and to fix what was broken instead of throwing it away. The old wooden table in the dining room had been with me for decades. My husband and I bought it secondhand the year we opened our first bakery, and every scratch on its surface told a story. The sofa was simple, upholstered in faded fabric, soft from years of use. And the wedding photo on the wall, slightly yellowed now, was my favorite thing in the house. Every time I looked at it, I remembered the warmth of that day, the smell of flour still on our hands when we said our vows. But Katherine saw none of that. To her, everything in the house was outdated, dusty, and unfit for a modern lifestyle. She once called my living room charming in a vintage way, then suggested replacing everything for a fresh start. I smiled politely, but inside something tightened. She couldn't understand that these things weren't clutter. They were history. To her, simplicity meant failure, and frugality meant poverty. She often laughed about how people from my generation didn't know how to live well, as if saving money was a sign of shame instead of wisdom. Sometimes, when she sat scrolling through her phone, I would catch my reflection in the window, behind her gray-haired, quiet small, and wonder if she saw me the same way she saw the furniture, as something old and unnecessary. But then I would touch the edge of that wooden table, feel the grooves left by time, and remind myself that true worth never needed glitter to be seen. I didn't envy her. I only pitied how fragile her world must be built entirely on what others could see. The first week Katherine moved in, everything about the house began to change, not slowly, but all at once. From the moment she arrived, she filled the air with her presence, loud and restless, like a storm pretending to be sunshine. She turned the music up so loud that even the walls seemed to vibrate. Then, without asking, she began rearranging things: the living room shelves, the curtains, even the photographs on the mantel. When I came downstairs that morning, I saw her dragging a small box toward the trash bin. Inside were things that had been mine for decades: an old vase from my late husband, a tea set from my mother, a few faded photo frames. "These are outdated," she said with a casual shrug. "We should make the place look more modern." I tried to stay calm, but my voice trembled when I said, "Katherine, those things mean something to me. You have no right to throw them away." She looked at me, her smile still plastered on, but her eyes sharp as glass. "Of course, Mom," she replied, her tone honeyed and false. "I didn't mean to upset you. I just thought you'd want to change." When Patrick walked in, she instantly softened her voice, looping her arm through his. "Honey," she cooed, "your mom doesn't like me touching her things." Patrick hesitated, looking between us, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. Love for his wife, guilt toward his mother. But instead of saying anything, he just sighed and said, Let's not argue. It's just furniture. That moment hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't about the furniture. It was about losing the quiet authority I once had in my own home. In the following days, Catherine's habits became part of the air we breathed. Her loud laughter in the mornings, her constant rearranging her scent of expensive perfume that clung to every room. She was polite enough in front of others, but when our eyes met, her smile faltered into something colder, the kind of smile that told you she'd already decided you no longer mattered. Patrick began to avoid real conversations with me. At dinner, he'd keep his head down, nodding along to her every word. I caught glimpses of regret in his expression, but it was always too fleeting to hold on to. And just like that, my home, once warm, steady, and full of quiet, began to feel like someone else's stage. I could sense it deep inside. I no longer belonged here. The space might still be mine on paper, but spiritually, emotionally, it had been conquered by youth, by vanity, by the hollow noise of someone who mistook control for confidence. Katherine stopped contributing to the groceries one month, saying she was saving for when they had a baby. I didn't argue. It wasn't my place to count every dollar, but it didn't take long for me to notice her daily deliveries from expensive restaurants, the shopping bags with glossy designer logos, and the new velvet sofa that arrived one afternoon without warning. She said the old one smelled musty and depressed. The new one, she claimed, would make the house more alive. I stood by the doorway watching two men carry away the sofa I had owned for 20 years, the one my husband used to nap on after long days at the bakery. My hands trembled slightly, but I stayed quiet. Sometimes silence is the only way left to keep your dignity. Then came the small insults, soft at first, then sharp enough to cut. One morning, she wrinkled her nose at the waffles I had baked and said the smell reminded her of an old lady's kitchen. I laughed it off, pretending not to care, but that night I cried quietly in my room while Cookie and Snow curled beside me. Each morning, I still baked because I refused to let her erase the rhythm of my life. But even the scent of cinnamon began to feel like a rebellion. When her friends came over, she spoke loudly so I could hear. She joked that her mother-in-law was so frugal she wouldn't even turn on the air conditioner, and that living with me was like being trapped in the past. I heard their laughter drift down the hallway and tried to focus on my kneading. My ears burned, but I didn't respond. I had learned long ago that shouting only wastes your breath on people who don't listen. The worst part was how she treated my cats, my little companions, my comfort. Cookie, Ginger, and Snow had been with me through every lonely night. But Katherine hated them. She said they made the house smell like a shelter. More than once, I found them locked in the storage room, scratching desperately at the door. When I confronted her, she smiled sweetly and said it must have been an accident. Patrick began coming home later and later. He barely looked at me during dinner, answering in short, tired phrases. I could feel him slipping away one evening at a time. The house grew heavy with unspoken tension, the kind that seeps into the walls. And then one afternoon, it broke. Katherine stood in the middle of the living room, hands on her hips, saying that if I didn't replace all the ancient furniture, she would move out. I looked at her calm but tired and said softly, "If you're not happy here, you're free to leave." She stared at me as if I had slapped her, but I meant every word. It happened on an ordinary morning, or at least it began that way. The sun was streaming through the kitchen window, the smell of toast and coffee lingered in the air, and for a brief moment, everything seemed calm. Then out of nowhere, Katherine screamed so loud that even the cats jumped off the table. She was holding her phone, her eyes wide with disbelief and triumph. "My mom won the lottery. $1 million, Patrick." Her voice shook with excitement, her hands trembling as she waved the phone like proof of salvation. Patrick froze mid-bite, his fork suspended in the air. He managed a faint smile and said something like, That's amazing, but his tone carried more shock than joy. In that instant, something in the room shifted. Catherine's expression changed as if a switch had been flipped. The nervous laughter turned into a confident smirk, and her posture straightened with sudden pride. It was as though she had just stepped onto a stage she had always dreamed of, one where she no longer had to pretend. Within minutes, she was already talking about the future, her words spilling out faster than her thoughts. We can finally move into a real house with space and light. Not this cramped old place. Maybe new furniture, something elegant. I deserve that kind of life. She said it while glancing around the room, her gaze sweeping over every corner of my house as though she were seeing it for the first time, not with affection, but with disdain. I sat quietly stirring my tea, pretending not to notice. But inside, I felt a strange ache, a mixture of sadness and recognition. The way she looked at my old wooden cabinets, my worn sofa, and the framed photos on the wall, it was the look of someone who believed worth could be bought. Her excitement wasn't just about her mother's luck. It was about what that money could make her appear to be. Patrick tried to calm her down, saying it was his mother-in-law's win, not theirs. But Katherine brushed it off with a dismissive laugh, already speaking as if the fortune were half hers. She kept saying words like upgrade status and finally live properly. I looked at her face, the same face that once smiled politely at me over morning coffee, now gleaming with greed disguised as ambition. In that moment, I understood something quietly painful. Money doesn't change people, it reveals them. And what I saw in her eyes wasn't joy. It was hunger, the kind that never stops once it begins. That afternoon, the house felt unusually quiet, the kind of silence that comes before something breaks. I was folding laundry in the living room when Katherine walked in her heels, clicking sharply against the wooden floor. Her tone was casual, but her words were not. "Patrick, pack your things," she said, as if she were announcing dinner plans. "From now on, we're living at my mother's house. It's more modern, more civilized. It suits us better." Patrick looked up from his phone, startled, his voice stumbling over itself. "What about my mom?" he asked softly, like a child afraid of the answer. Katherine turned to him, her face sweet, but her eyes cold. "Your mother is fine here," she said smoothly. "She loves her little world, the smell of old bread, the dusty furniture. Let her stay comfortable in it." She smiled as she spoke, the kind of smile that pretends to be kind but cuts like glass. For a second, the room froze. The afternoon light fell across her face, making her look almost angelic if one didn't hear the poison behind her words. Patrick lowered his gaze, torn between guilt and submission. I could see the struggle in his eyes, the boy I once raised, still flickering beneath the man who now stood silent. I wanted to tell him to stay, to remind him that loyalty means something, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I folded one more towel, placed it neatly on the stack, and said quietly, "If that's what you want, I won't stop you." My voice didn't shake, though my hands did. I refused to beg for space in my own home. There was a strange dignity in surrender, not weakness, but the calm of someone who has already seen how the story will end. Katherine turned toward the door, her perfume trailing behind her like a final insult. She didn't thank me or even look back. She simply picked up her purse, adjusted her sunglasses, and walked out with the proud gait of someone who believed she had won. For a moment, I almost believed it too. But then as the door closed, I caught the faint curve of her smile. Not of joy, but of satisfaction, the cruel kind that comes when someone believes they've successfully diminished another. I stood there alone, the quiet pressing in. The clock ticked. Cookie jumped onto the sofa, curling against my arm. I stroked her fur, steadying my breath. They could take their luxury, their polished furniture, their shallow pride. But they would never understand. Peace cannot be bought. and cruelty dressed in sweetness still leaves the same bitter taste. Before she left, Katherine turned once more toward the living room, her eyes scanning every corner as if committing it all to memory, not out of sentiment, but out of disgust. Then she smirked and said, her voice dripping with contempt, "This house smells poor, just like someone who refuses to change." The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and suffocating. Patrick stood frozen beside her, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the floor. He didn't defend me, didn't even flinch. As she moved toward the door, her heel caught the edge of the lavender pot by the window, the one I had planted with my husband years ago, the only living thing I tended every morning to keep his memory alive. She looked down at it, paused for half a second, then deliberately kicked it over. The clay shattered, the soil spilled across the floor, and the smell of crushed lavender filled the room. My breath caught, but I didn't move. I just watched the petals scatter like ashes. At that moment, Ginger, my curious little cat, darted out from behind the sofa, startled by the noise. Katherine sneered and swung her foot again, catching Ginger on her side. The cat let out a high, pained cry and ran limping toward the hallway. Patrick looked up, then eyes wide, as if realizing what had just happened, but still said nothing. His silence hurt more than her cruelty. There was a time he would have stepped in, would have told her to stop, but that time had long passed. The house felt colder than ever. I could feel my pulse in my throat, but I refused to let a single tear fall. I walked to the mess by the door, bent down and picked up one broken piece of the lavender pot, tracing the crack with my finger. My voice came out low, but steady. "When you kick something small and helpless," I said softly, "remember, karma has a way of finding its path back to you." Katherine rolled her eyes, muttered something under her breath, and slammed the door behind her. The sound echoed through the house, sharp and final. I stayed there for a long while, the smell of lavender still lingering, faint, sweet, but broken, like a memory that refused to die. Cookie crept up beside me, brushing against my leg, and I finally exhaled. I wasn't angry anymore, just unbearably tired. People like her think they win when they walk away, but they never understand. Cruelty doesn't destroy the one who endures it. It destroys the one who commits it. When the door finally closed, the sound of the car engine faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt almost sacred. The house stood still, no more voices, no tension hanging in the air, only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft meow of Ginger somewhere near the hallway. The smell of old bread still lingered from the morning, sweet and familiar, wrapping the empty space in something that felt like both memory and peace. I walked to the broken lavender pot, kneeling beside it. The soil had scattered across the floor, mixed with shards of clay and fallen petals. Carefully, I began picking up each stem one by one, brushing off the dust and setting them into a new pot I found in the corner. My hands trembled slightly, but not from anger, from tenderness. It felt like a small ceremony, a way to say goodbye, not just to a plant, but to a chapter of my life that had long stopped blooming. When I pressed the soil down around the fragile roots, I whispered, "You've survived worse, haven't you?" The sunlight slipped through the curtains, landing on the floor in quiet stripes. For the first time in months, the air didn't feel heavy. There was no perfume clouding the hallway, no sharp voice echoing orders from the living room, just stillness, and in that stillness, a strange sense of freedom. I realized I wasn't sad. There were no tears left to cry. What I felt instead was a lightness I hadn't known in years, as if the weight of constant humiliation had quietly lifted from my shoulders the moment that car drove away. I sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, the steam curling softly into the air. Cookie jumped onto my lap, purring gently, her warmth pressing against my hand. I thought of my husband, then how he used to say that sometimes peace doesn't come with joy, but with release. Looking around the house, I saw not what had been lost, but what remained: the old wooden furniture, the fading wedding photo, the smell of baked cinnamon, and the quiet that finally felt like mine again. I took a slow breath and smiled faintly. Maybe God just freed me, I murmured, from something I was too afraid to let go of. And for the first time in a long time, I meant it. 3 days passed, and life slowly began to return to its quiet rhythm. The house once again filled with small, familiar sounds: the soft static of the FM radio, the comforting scent of waffles browning in the pan, and the gentle brush of Cookie's fur against my leg. I moved through the rooms with calm hands watering the new lavender pot by the window, straightening the tablecloth, and humming an old hymn. For a moment, it almost felt as though peace had returned for good. But deep down, I sensed something different: a stillness too perfect, the kind that comes not after a storm, but before another one. That uneasy feeling proved right when whispers began to spread through the church. During coffee hour, one of the women leaned toward me and spoke in a low voice, as if sharing a confession. She said Katherine and her mother had fought bitterly over the lottery money. Apparently, the mother had refused to give her the share she wanted, and Katherine's brother had gotten involved. What began as an argument over fairness had turned into a shouting match, then a scuffle. Someone even said the police were called. I listened silently, stirring my tea, pretending not to care, but a quiet ache formed in my chest. It wasn't joy or pity, just a weary understanding that greed never ends cleanly. Another woman added that Patrick had been seen wandering around town alone, staying in a motel, too ashamed to come to church. She said his wife's family had turned cold, treating him as an outsider now that the money was in question. I pictured him sitting alone in some unfamiliar room, the weight of his choices pressing on him, and for a brief moment, I almost wished he would come home. But then I remembered, home isn't just a place you return to. It's a heart you have to earn your way back into. That evening I lit the small lamp in the kitchen. The glow spread across the old wooden counter, soft and golden. The air smelled faintly of lavender and flower. I stood there, hands wrapped around my cup of tea, and whispered to myself, money can buy a new house, but never new character. And sometimes God gives people wealth, not as a gift, but as a test to see if they are worthy of it. The light flickered for a moment, then steadied, casting long shadows across the walls. I looked at them and thought maybe the darkness hadn't left. It had just moved to another house. 3 days after they had left, I was in the kitchen pulling a tray of waffles from the oven when I heard a frantic knock at the door. The sound was sharp, desperate, the kind that carries both shame and fear. I wiped my hands on a towel and walked slowly to the front of the house. When I opened the door, there they were, Patrick and Katherine, standing in the cold afternoon light, looking nothing like the proud couple who had driven away just days before. Patrick's face was pale, his eyes sunken with exhaustion. There was a small cut across his hand, and his shirt was wrinkled, stained with something dark. Katherine stood beside him, trembling slightly. Her hair was messy mascara streaked down her cheeks, and there was a faint smell of alcohol clinging to her clothes. A bruise peeked from beneath her sleeve, and her voice cracked when she tried to speak. Mom, she began, but the words failed her. Patrick swallowed hard and said, Mom, please, let us come back. It's not what you think over there. His tone was soft but frantic, the tone of a man whose pride had finally broken. I didn't ask what had happened. I didn't need to. The bruises, the torn clothes, and the silence between them told me enough. I knew the storm they had created had finally turned on them. For a moment I looked at them both, the son I had raised and the woman who had torn apart the piece of my home. The air between us was heavy with everything that had been said and done. But inside me there was no anger left, only clarity. I had learned that sometimes the kindest thing a person can do is to stop rescuing those who refuse to change. My voice was calm when I finally spoke. "This house," I said slowly, "has no place for those who look down on it." My tone was gentle, but my words fell like stone. Katherine looked away, biting her lip, tears welling up again. Patrick's shoulders sagged. For the first time, he looked at me not as a mother to lean on, but as a woman who could stand firm without him. I closed the door quietly. No shouting, no anger, just the sound of wood meeting wood. Behind the door, I stood for a moment, my heart steady, my hands still warm from baking. The silence that followed wasn't cruel. It was righteous. The silence of someone who had finally drawn a line. For the first time, Patrick had seen his mother not as fragile, but as someone who had learned the power of peace over pity. They rented a small house just down the street, close enough for me to see their porch light at night, yet far enough for them to pretend they were living independently. It was a clever choice, I'll admit. They could watch me without seeming intrusive, and I could sense their presence without ever being asked to forgive them. A week after moving in, Katherine began her performance. She showed up at my door with a store-bought pie, smiling too brightly, her tone syrupy sweet. "I made too much dinner," she said, though the plastic container still had a supermarket label on it. Another time, she brought flowers, claiming they were just to brighten my day. Her words were soft, rehearsed, almost convincing to anyone who didn't know her. She spoke about fresh starts and second chances, acting as though humility could erase all the cruelty she had once poured into this house. Patrick followed her lead, quieter, but still complicit. He often stood behind her, hands in his pockets, eyes lowered, mumbling that things were getting better, that they were trying. I wanted to believe him. A mother always does. But there was something calculated in the way Katherine's visits grew more frequent, the way she lingered just long enough to bring up practical matters. It began with small things. She mentioned her electricity bill, said it was a little higher than expected, and wondered if I could help just this once. Then came the talk about a new credit card she wanted to open, saying that if I co-signed, the approval would be instant. She laughed nervously, insisting it was just a formality. Every word was polished, practiced, and poisonous beneath its sweetness. But I had spent too many years running a bakery, negotiating contracts, and watching people's faces as they lied through politeness. I recognized the signs. Trust once broken doesn't heal through charm, only through time and truth, and Katherine had neither to offer. So I listened quietly, nodded when needed, but never agreed to a thing. When she realized her attempts weren't working, she changed tactics. Her visits became rarer, her tone colder, but her eyes still searched me whenever we crossed paths, measuring, calculating. I could almost feel her resentment growing like mold spreading behind clean walls. That night, as I sat by the window, I watched the faint light from their rented house flicker through the trees. I thought to myself, people like Katherine never truly repent. They only pause long enough to plan the next move. And this time I would be ready. One morning, as I opened the front door to let in the fresh air, my foot slipped slightly on the top step. It was quick, just a small slide, but enough to send a chill through me. I steadied myself against the railing and looked down. The sunlight caught a thin, slick film that shimmered faintly on the stone surface. I bent closer and rubbed it between my fingers. It wasn't water. It was oil, thick, mechanical, and faintly metallic. The smell confirmed it. It was the kind of lubricant Patrick used back at the garage. At first, I wanted to believe it was an accident. Maybe he had dropped some during one of his visits. Maybe a bottle had leaked. But then I saw more of it, dark, greasy streaks near the back gate, and again by the side porch, where I often stepped out to water my plants. The pattern wasn't random, it was deliberate. Someone had been there carefully spreading it where my feet would land. My heart beat slower, not faster. Fear didn't come, calculation did. I remembered what the church lawyer, Mr. Rollins, had told me months earlier when he gave a sermon on elder safety. If you ever feel something isn't right, he said, don't confront it immediately. Collect evidence first. Truth speaks louder when it's recorded. His words came back to me like a calm voice through the fog. That evening, I drove to the hardware store and bought a small set of security cameras, motion sensors, and a pack of rechargeable batteries. The young clerk offered to help install them, but I smiled and said I preferred to do it myself. Years of running a bakery had made me patient and precise. I'd decorated hundreds of cakes, each flower petal piped by hand, so setting up a few discreet cameras felt almost natural. When I returned home, the house was quiet, except for the ticking clock in the hallway. I set to work. I placed one camera above the front door, another facing the back gate, and hid a third inside a hanging flower basket near the porch. The cords were tucked neatly under the railing, invisible unless someone knew where to look. I double-checked the angles, adjusted the sensors, and tested them twice. Each light blinked back at me, ready. As I stood there under the porch light, wiping my hands clean, a strange calm settled over me. I wasn't scared anymore. I had learned something that night. Wisdom doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's quiet, steady, and watching just like a camera in the dark. I began documenting everything. Every small detail mattered now: the time, the sound, the angle of light. Each morning, I checked the footage from the cameras, saving clips where something seemed off. At first, it was only shadows and faint movements. But on the third night, the camera by the front porch caught what I had feared: Katherine creeping up the steps, a small bottle glinting in her hand. She glanced around nervously while Patrick stood a few feet away, pretending to check his phone, clearly keeping watch. She crouched down near the doormat, unscrewed the cap, and poured something along the edge of the step. The lens caught the sheen of oil under the porch light. My heart didn't race. It slowed, calm, precise, deliberate. I knew exactly what I needed to do. The next morning, I copied the footage onto a flash drive, labeled it carefully, and slipped it into my purse, along with a notepad where I had written every incident, dates, times, even the weather. Then I drove downtown to meet Mr. Caldwell, my late husband's old attorney. He used to buy lemon tarts from my bakery every Friday and had been one of the kindest men in our community. When I walked into his office, he looked up surprised but warm. "Abigail," he said, "I haven't seen you since Robert's memorial." "How have you been?" I placed the flash drive on his desk. "I've been better," I replied. He watched the footage in silence, his jaw tightening. When it ended, he leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and said, "This is more than mischief. This is harassment and endangerment against a senior citizen. You have every right to file a formal complaint, even seek a restraining order." His tone was steady, but his eyes carried something sharper: disapproval for what he had just seen. I sat there quietly for a moment, looking out his window at the gray Seattle skyline. The word lawsuit had always sounded heavy to me, messy, bitter, unnecessary. But I knew now that kindness alone wouldn't protect me. People like Katherine saw patience as weakness and mercy as permission. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. I told Mr. Caldwell I didn't want revenge, only safety. He nodded, saying sometimes the law itself can be the strongest lesson. We prepared the paperwork that afternoon. As I left his office, the rain began to fall, softly tapping on my umbrella like applause. I realized I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was reclaiming the peace that had been stolen from me, not with anger, but with intelligence and proof. I changed the locks the next morning. The locksmith worked quickly, replacing every cylinder and hinge while I stood nearby, watching each turn of his screwdriver with quiet focus. When he left, I tested the new key twice, hearing the clean click of safety that had been missing for far too long. That afternoon, I called my insurance agent and updated my homeowner's policy, adding extra coverage for property damage and harassment. Then I uploaded the video evidence to a secure cloud drive, storing copies in two separate folders, one under my name and another under my lawyer's. If anything happened to me or to my house, the truth would survive. Outwardly, nothing seemed different. I still woke up before sunrise to bake my waffles, still walked to church every Sunday with my basket of bread, still waved to my neighbors with the same gentle smile. But beneath that calm routine, something inside me had shifted. The woman who once tried to avoid conflict had been replaced by someone quietly preparing for Judgment Day, not with anger, but with precision. Every step I took now had purpose. Every silence I kept was a form of strategy. Even the cats seemed to sense it. Cookie, Ginger, and Snow had grown more alert. Whenever Katherine passed by the gate, their ears perked up, and they would position themselves near the doorway, tails flicking like little sentinels. I used to laugh at the thought of them guarding me, but lately their presence felt symbolic, as if they too understood that the time for fear was over. Some evenings I would sit by the window, notebook in hand, reviewing my records. Dates, times, behavior, all neatly documented. I wasn't obsessed with revenge. I was devoted to truth. I wanted everything to unfold naturally, lawfully, under the clear light of justice. And justice, I knew, doesn't need to shout. It only needs patience. As I turned off the kitchen light one night, I caught my reflection in the window, silver hair, steady eyes, a calm smile that held no bitterness. I whispered softly to myself, "If truth is justice, then all I must do is wait for the right moment." Calmness is the sharpest weapon of those once underestimated. The words didn't sound like defiance. They sounded like faith. The kind of faith forged not in weakness, but in quiet strength. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready, not for revenge, but for the reckoning that would come naturally, as surely as morning follows night. On the third night, the camera saw everything. The lens watched Katherine come up the walk with a small bottle in her hand, moving on the balls of her feet like a thief who believes the house is asleep. She crouched on the top step and tilted the bottle, letting a slow, glittering line of oil slide along the edge of the threshold. Her head turned left and right, a quick cut of the eyes, then back to her task, until the stone shone with that slick metallic sheen I knew too well. When she finished, she wiped the mouth of the bottle with a tissue and tucked it into her coat, as if tidiness could make the act clean. I sat at the kitchen table the next morning and replayed the footage in silence. My chest did not pound. My hands did not shake. I felt something colder than anger, a stillness that comes when the pattern finally reveals itself. She wanted me to fall. She wanted bruises and bandages and a reason to return as the helpful daughter-in-law who sacrifices to care for the old woman. She wanted sympathy to become a key that would open my door forever. It was not only contempt, it was a plan built on calculation and on the hope that the law of filial duty could be twisted into a pass to occupy my home again. I cataloged the file with the others and saved a copy to a new folder. Then I slipped a USB into my purse and drove to the office of Mr. Whitman, the attorney who had eaten my lemon bars for 20 years and who once helped my husband write our wills. He watched the video from start to finish without a word. When it ended, he leaned back, folded his hands, and spoke in the voice he reserves for hard truths. He said the evidence was clear that what I had captured showed harassment and endangerment, and that the safest path forward was patience. He told me not to confront them yet, because people who make traps often step into them when they think no one is looking. I left his office under a pale sky and felt the air cool against my face. Back home, I labeled the drive, placed a second copy in the tin where I keep baptism cards and bakery receipts, and wrote the time and date in my notebook. The house was quiet. The cat slept in a stripe of sunlight on the floor. I boiled water, poured tea, and watched steam rise like a promise. I was not a victim. I was a witness. I would wait steady as a metronome until the truth walked in on its own feet and the door of justice closed behind it. A few days later, I heard the sound of hurried footsteps on the porch. When I opened the door, Katherine stood there glowing too much, too bright, like someone playing a part she'd practiced in front of a mirror. In her hand was a glossy ultrasound photo, which she held out like a trophy. "We think it's a miracle," she said, her voice trembling with fake emotion. "God must be blessing our family. You'll let us come back now, won't you, Mom?" Behind her, Patrick hovered like a shadow. His hands were shaking slightly, his eyes fixed somewhere near the ground. He looked exhausted, worn thin by weeks of chaos, yet still tethered to the woman who had mastered the art of emotional manipulation. He didn't say a word. Katherine, as always, filled the silence for him. She launched into her story, her tone soft and tragic. The rent was too high, her health was fragile, stress was affecting her pregnancy. She said she wanted to come back to take care of me, using that phrase like perfume sweet at first, but cloying when you catch the real scent beneath. Her voice carried the weight of self-pity, but her eyes gave her away, sharp, assessing, waiting for me to soften. I stood still, watching her performance. The trembling hands, the gentle smile, the way she pressed the ultrasound photo closer to my chest, every movement calculated. I had seen this before in people who used emotion as a weapon. They didn't need truth. They needed a stage. Patrick finally looked up, his eyes glassy with guilt. For a brief second, I saw the little boy who used to help me knead dough in the bakery covered in flour, laughing without fear. But that boy was long gone, replaced by a man too afraid to stand between right and wrong. I took a slow breath, forcing my face into a calm, almost tender expression. "A miracle, you say?" I replied softly. "Then we should celebrate it properly." Katherine's eyes flickered with cautious relief. "Why don't you both come by tomorrow evening? I'll make tea and some of my cinnamon rolls. There's something I'd like to show you." She smiled, mistaking my politeness for surrender. "Of course, Mom. That would mean a lot to us." I watched them walk away, her arm hooked through Patrick's like a claim, her body language triumphant. But inside, I felt none of the fear or anger she expected, only the steady clarity of someone who already held the truth in her hands and was ready to reveal it. I prepared the tea table as if it were a sacred ritual. The porcelain cups were arranged neatly, the cinnamon rolls still warm, and the scent of lavender from the garden drifted through the open window. The late afternoon sunlight poured across the living room, landing perfectly on the television screen, where the USB had already been plugged in. Everything was calm, deliberate, the quiet before revelation. When the doorbell rang, I didn't rush. I moved with steady hands, opening the door, to find Katherine, dressed carefully. Her hair styled, her smile bright and confident. Patrick followed behind, silent and weary, his shoulders slumped as if he already sensed something was wrong. I gestured for them to come in and motioned toward the tea table. "Sit," I said gently. "We'll talk while it's still warm." Katherine began her usual act, the soft voice, the practiced smile, the eyes wandering around the house as though measuring possession. She spoke about wanting forgiveness, about second chances, about how the baby needed a peaceful home. Her tone was tender, almost convincing to anyone who didn't know her. But her words rolled too easily, her performance too polished. As she spoke, I simply reached for the remote. Without a word, I pressed play. The faint click of the TV broke the silence, and within seconds, the footage appeared on the screen. There she was, Katherine, crouching on my front step at night, a small bottle in her hand pouring oil across the threshold, while glancing nervously over her shoulder. The image was crystal clear. The proof undeniable. The teacup slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor, tea spreading across the rug, like a confession. Patrick's face turned pale. He stumbled back into the couch, his hands gripping his hair, voice shaking. "Oh my God. What have you done?" he whispered, staring at her in disbelief. Katherine stood frozen. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The confident glow that once surrounded her had drained away completely, leaving only shock and shame. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I looked at her calm, steady, certain. "This is my house," I said evenly. "Not a stage for your performances." No one spoke after that. The video replayed in an endless loop, her actions mirrored back to her over and over again. The sunlight shifted lower through the window, stretching long across the wooden floor. And in that quiet room, stripped of all pretense, the truth finally stood alone, clear, undeniable, and complete. Katherine's lips trembled as she tried to speak, her face drained of color. "I was only cleaning the step," she stammered. "It was just floor cleaner, not oil." The words tumbled out unevenly, desperate, unconvincing. Her voice cracked halfway through, but no one responded. The silence in the room was heavier than shouting could ever be. Then Patrick broke. His hands slammed against the table, rattling the teacups. "Enough, Katherine." His voice was raw, sharp, the kind of voice that comes from months of bottled shame. For the first time, he didn't defend her. He turned toward me, eyes wide and filled with tears, and I saw in them everything he hadn't said: regret, guilt, exhaustion. It was the silence of a son who finally understood the damage his weakness had allowed. I didn't move for a moment. Then quietly I reached into the drawer beside me and took out a plain envelope. I laid it gently on the table between us. "This came from Mr. Whitman," I said. Katherine's hands twitched, but she didn't reach for it. Patrick stared at it as if it might explode. The envelope was thin, but its weight filled the room. He hesitated, then slowly opened it. Inside was the formal legal notice printed on crisp paper, signed and sealed. The words were simple but devastating: harassment and endangerment of an elderly person. The language was clinical, but its meaning cut deeper than any insult could. Patrick's fingers tightened around the page. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Finally, his voice cracked. "Mom, are you going to press charges against us?" His tone wasn't angry, it was frightened, almost pleading. I looked at him steadily, not with cruelty, but with clarity. "No," I said quietly. "I'm not suing you. I'm reminding you that every action carries a consequence." The words hung between us, measured and calm. Katherine sank into her chair, eyes glassy, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Patrick bowed his head, unable to meet my gaze. The sunlight had dimmed outside, and the faint hum of the refrigerator filled the silence like background music to a confession. For the first time, I saw Patrick not as my son, but as a man broken by the choices he refused to make. And yet beneath that heartbreak, there was a strange peace. The peace of knowing that truth had finally spoken for itself, without anger, without vengeance. Justice, I realized, didn't always need to shout. Sometimes it arrived in silence, steady, undeniable, and complete. Katherine burst into tears, clutching her stomach as if in sudden pain. Her sobs were loud, theatrical, the kind that once might have fooled me. But not this time. I stood still, watching her performance unravel, and when she looked up through trembling lashes, I spoke clearly, every word steady and measured. "Your doctor already confirmed to my lawyer that the ultrasound you showed me was fake." Tell me, Catherine, do you ever stop lying?" Her crying stopped instantly. The tears froze mid-motion. Her breath caught in her throat. She stared at me, her face emptying of expression, like a mask cracking under the weight of truth. Patrick turned away, unable to meet her eyes. The silence that filled the room was colder than anger. It was the silence of exposure. I didn't gloat, and I didn't raise my voice. There was no need. Truth doesn't require volume. It carries its own gravity. I walked toward the door, the floor creaking softly beneath my steps. "You should both leave now," I said evenly. "When my lawyer contacts you, sign the warning and don't come back." My tone was calm, final not as a threat, but as a boundary carved with dignity. Patrick stood frozen for a moment, his hands shaking slightly. He tried to speak, but no words came. Catherine looked around the room one last time, her gaze sweeping over the walls she had once wanted to claim. There was no fight left in her, only the hollow look of someone who finally realized she had nothing left to manipulate. I opened the door, letting the cool wind drift through the hallway. They stepped out quietly, their shadows stretching long across the porch as the sun began to set. For a moment, I simply stood there, hand resting on the doorknob, listening to the fading sound of their footsteps. Then I closed the door slowly, firmly, and felt the weight of years lift from my chest. The house was silent again, the kind of silence that doesn't echo with pain, but with peace. I looked around the living room, the teacups still on the table, the faint smell of cinnamon in the air, and realized it wasn't victory I felt. It was freedom. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a victim or even a survivor. I simply felt whole again, the rightful owner of my life, my home, and my calm. Outside, the wind rustled through the lavender bushes. I smiled faintly and whispered to myself, "The strongest voice is the one that doesn't need to shout." Within just a few days, the truth began to travel faster than I ever could have imagined, not through gossip, not through my words, but through the quiet power of what people saw with their own eyes. The video from the security camera, the one I had barely watched twice myself, somehow made its way across the neighborhood. It started with Mr. Jenkins, my neighbor from across the street, the one who had helped me check the footage. He told a few people at the church meeting that Sunday. From there, the story took on a life of its own. By Tuesday morning, people already knew. No one asked me directly, but their eyes said enough. The footage showed everything: Catherine sneaking oil onto the porch, glancing around nervously, and then running off when she thought no one was watching. There were no arguments left, to make no need for confrontation. The truth had spoken in its purest form, silent, undeniable, and devastating. I didn't post the video anywhere. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Sometimes truth doesn't require an audience. It simply finds its way to those who need to see it. By midweek, whispers filled the air around the neighborhood. I overheard them while walking to the market, their voices hushed but sharp. "That's the daughter-in-law who mocked her mother-in-law for being poor," one woman said. "And now look what happened, caught red-handed trying to harm her." Some spoke with shock, others with quiet satisfaction, but no one doubted what they'd seen. The story spread to nearby blocks, to the small church group, to the market clerks, to the school mothers. It became less about scandal and more about justice, the kind that arrives without shouting, without lawsuits, without revenge. Through it all, I kept my routine unchanged. Every Sunday, I still went to church. Every Thursday, I baked cookies and bread for the charity group, kneading the dough with calm, deliberate hands. People greeted me differently now. Their nods carried respect, not pity. Some even offered to help with groceries or invited me to lunch. But what I cherished most wasn't their sympathy. It was the quiet acknowledgement in their eyes, the way they seemed to understand that I hadn't let anger consume me. I had allowed the truth to work on its own. Justice, I realized, doesn't always come from courts or confrontations. Sometimes it comes from silence when goodness refuses to shout, yet still stands firm. Attorney Whitman moved swiftly. Within a week, the official legal notice was filed with the local court, a formal complaint citing harassment and deliberate endangerment of an elderly person. It was short, factual, and impeccably written, leaving no room for manipulation or denial. For the first time in this long, exhausting story, the law was no longer just an abstract idea to me. It had become something tangible, a shield built of evidence, patience, and truth. The meeting took place in Whitman's office on a gray Monday morning. Patrick and Katherine sat across the polished oak table, both looking smaller than I remembered. Whitman, calm and professional, explained the terms of the settlement. "You are required," he said, his tone measured, to sign this written agreement, stating that neither of you will approach, contact, or harass Mrs. Hale in any form, directly or indirectly. He paused, letting the words settle. Additionally, you will each contribute to a symbolic civil compensation of $5,000. It's not about the amount. It's about acknowledgement. Katherine's lips trembled, but she said nothing. Patrick nodded weakly, his shoulders slumping as he stared at the paper in front of him. I watched them both in silence. $5,000 meant nothing compared to the sleepless nights, the fear, and the humiliation they had caused. But it wasn't about money. It was about accountability, about forcing them to see in black and white that what they had done carried consequences. Whitman continued, his voice cool and clear. If you violate this agreement even once, the case will immediately move to criminal court. The evidence has already been submitted and time-stamped. There will be no second warning. He looked directly at Katherine as he spoke. She couldn't hold his gaze. Her mascara had started to run, but no tears actually fell. It wasn't grief. She felt it was the realization that her charm, her persuasion, her endless words meant nothing against the weight of the law. Patrick finally lifted his head, his voice low and heavy. "We understand," he said. His hand shook slightly as he signed. Katherine hesitated, but eventually she picked up the pen and added her name beneath his. The sound of the pen scratching the paper felt like a final curtain closing. When it was over, I stood, thanked Whitman quietly, and left without looking back. Outside, the air smelled clean after the morning rain. For the first time, I felt something close to safety, not because I had won, but because justice had taken its rightful place between us. After the legal hearing, everything changed. Patrick and Katherine had no choice but to leave. They moved out quietly, avoiding the neighbors' eyes, their car packed with boxes and silence. They found a small, worn-down apartment in Kent, far enough from Seattle for people not to recognize their names, but close enough for regret to linger. It wasn't exile by law, but by shame. Patrick took on extra shifts at the auto shop sometimes, working until past midnight. His hands, once steady and skilled, now carried the weight of exhaustion. I heard through an old church friend that he'd begun fixing old cars for cash just to keep up with rent and bills. Katherine, on the other hand, lost her job not long after the scandal spread. Her manager, a woman I once met at the bakery, had told her bluntly that the store can't afford moral drama. They learned what independence truly meant, not the glamorous kind Katherine used to flaunt, but the quiet, humbling version that comes from necessity. They cooked cheap meals, stretched their groceries to last the week, and argued about electricity bills. For the first time, they lived the life they once mocked, a modest, self-sufficient existence, built not on appearances, but on survival. Sometimes, when I sat in my garden drinking tea, neighbors would whisper updates. Someone had seen Patrick at the local grocery, wearing grease-stained overalls, but looking thinner, calmer. Another said Katherine rarely went out anymore. I didn't rejoice. I didn't pity them either. Life, I realized, had a way of teaching lessons no courtroom ever could. There was a strange comfort in knowing they were learning responsibility the hard way. They had once mocked my thriftiness, my old-fashioned habits, my insistence on earning what you keep. Now, stripped of everything, they were forced to face the truth I had lived by all along, that dignity isn't inherited or married into. It's built day by day by owning the consequences of one's choices. And perhaps that was their gentlest punishment, not prison or scandal, but silence. A life without applause, without shortcuts, where every small task reminded them of what they had once taken for granted. I sometimes thought of Patrick, hoping that one day he might find peace through humility, but I never reached out. Some distances once necessary must be kept for peace to last. It was early morning when I heard the sound of hesitant footsteps on the porch. Through the lace curtain, I saw Patrick standing there alone, shoulders slightly hunched, holding a small bouquet of lavender and a white envelope. The air was crisp, the kind that made every sound sharper, even the soft crinkle of paper in his trembling hands. He didn't ring the bell right away. He just stood there, as if waiting for courage to catch up with him. When I opened the door, he didn't step inside. His voice was low, barely above a whisper. "Mom," he said, eyes fixed on the floor. "I understand now. I'm sorry." The words were simple, but they carried years of silence, guilt, and shame. I didn't answer. I just nodded and reached for the flowers. The lavender smelled faintly of the past, of my garden, of better days, of forgiveness, trying to bloom where pain once rooted deep. Patrick handed me the envelope next. Inside was the compensation money he and Katherine had been ordered to pay. $5,000 neatly folded clean, untouched. He didn't say anything about it, and I didn't either. The gesture itself mattered more than the amount. It was his way of taking responsibility, of returning something broken to its rightful place. We stood there for a while, not talking. The morning light spread slowly across the porch, touching his face. I saw the lines of exhaustion, but also a kind of clarity, the beginning of humility. For the first time, I felt no anger, no resentment. What replaced it was quieter, heavier compassion, mixed with disappointment. My son had failed in many ways, but at least he had learned to bow his head. That perhaps was his first honest act in years. When he finally turned to leave, I watched him go without calling him back. His figure faded down the street, and the sound of his footsteps blended with the rustling of the wind. I closed the door gently, placed the lavender in a vase, and whispered a short prayer, not for him to come back, but for him to find peace within his own repentance. Forgiveness, I realize, doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't erase the past or justify the wrong. It simply lightens the heart so that both sides can carry their burdens without hatred. In forgiving, I didn't free him, I freed myself. Because sometimes the truest form of justice isn't punishment, but letting others face the weight of their own conscience. I spent an entire afternoon at my desk, the same wooden one my husband and I once used, to balance bakery ledgers rewriting my will. The papers lay neatly in front of me, each word chosen with care and calm. For the first time in years, there was no bitterness guiding my pen, only clarity. I divided what I had built over a lifetime. Part of my savings would go to the Seattle Elder Abuse Protection Fund, an organization that defends those too kind to defend themselves. The rest I assigned to the local shelter for stray cats, those quiet witnesses who had kept me company through the worst storms of my life. When I finished, I folded a letter by hand and placed it on top of the will. My handwriting was slower now, but steady. I wrote, "The things people call poor are sometimes the only things that help us keep our dignity." I sealed it, knowing that long after I was gone, someone might read it and understand that wealth has never been measured in money, but in peace of mind. The house around me was the same as ever, The old wooden table, the faded sofa, the faint scent of cinnamon and waffle batter in the mornings. But something had shifted. This was no longer a place marked by humiliation. It was a home reclaimed by respect. I could almost hear the echo of laughter that used to fill it, and I smiled, realizing that pain had not destroyed me. It had refined me. As the evening light poured through the window, I walked to the door and closed it gently. The hinges creaked, but even that sound felt familiar, comforting. Outside, the wind brushed against the lavender by the porch, carrying its scent through the house. I stood still for a moment, breathing it in, feeling the calm spread through every corner of my being. Justice, I thought, doesn't always arrive with noise or spectacle. Sometimes it moves quietly, through patience, through dignity, through the simple act of refusing to hate. The people who wronged me had already faced their lessons. I didn't need to see them suffer. Their silence, their absence was proof enough. I turned off the lights, the room bathed in twilight gold. Cookie Ginger and Snow stretched lazily near the fireplace, content and safe. I smiled at them, whispering a thank you, not just for their presence, but for reminding me that love, even in its smallest form, can be a shield. As I walked toward my chair and sat down with a cup of tea, I realized that this was what true peace felt like: quiet, earned, and unshakable. The first morning of spring arrived gentle and golden. I sat by the window, a tray of warm waffles beside me, the smell of butter and cinnamon filling the quiet house. Cookie Ginger and Snow were curled up peacefully, their small breaths rising and falling in rhythm with the sunlight. Outside, the lavender I once thought would never grow again had blossomed soft purple, alive. It swayed lightly in the breeze, as if reminding me that peace always finds its way back, no matter how long the storm lasts. I looked out at the garden, feeling the calm that only comes after pain has finally settled into wisdom. Life had not been easy, but it had been fair. Every cruelty had turned into a lesson, every humiliation into strength. And through it all, I realized something simple, yet profound: justice for people like me, the elderly, the quiet, the ones too often dismissed, doesn't come from revenge. It comes from dignity, from standing tall without shouting, from choosing peace instead of anger. I thought of the many women like me, mothers, widows, grandmothers who have been ignored, used, or betrayed by those they loved most. I know some of you have carried that silence for years, thinking no one would understand. But your story matters. Every scar you've hidden is proof of your endurance. Every time you chose calm over chaos, you were already stronger than those who wronged you. So if you're listening to this, if you've ever felt small or disrespected in your own home, I want to tell you something. Your voice still matters. Your story still matters. Tell it. Share it. Somewhere, someone is waiting to hear it. Someone who might find courage through your truth. Because when we speak, we remind the world that age is not weakness. Kindness is not foolishness. And silence is not surrender. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment. It's about reclaiming your peace, your worth, your name. The lavender outside my window sways again in the light. I smile, feeling the air move softly through the open door. For the first time in a long time, everything is calm. And perhaps that is what justice truly looks like: quiet, graceful, and free.